I wanted to welcome you all to one of our Ed Talks. We're privileged and honored to be joined by Dr. Janelle Scott from the University of California at Berkeley. It's a particular privilege and honor for me to welcome her because I have known Janelle for over 20 years, as she and I were in graduate school together in our doctoral program back in the day at UCLA. So she and I have remained friends and collaborators all this time, and it's just such a privilege now to have her here at my institution. So I'm delighted that you're here. I wanted to tell you all a little bit about Janelle. She's an associate professor at the University of California at Berkeley in the Graduate School of Education and the African American Studies Department. She earned her PhD in education policy from UCLA and her BA in political science from UC Berkeley. And prior to earning her doctorate, she taught elementary school in Oakland, California. As you'll get to know today, her research explores the relationship between education policy and equality of opportunity, and centers on three related policy strands: the racial politics of public education, the politics of school choice, marketization and privatization, and the role of elite and community-based advocacy in shaping public education. Her work has appeared in many edited books and highly prestigious journals, including the Peabody Journal of Education, Educational Policy, AERJ, Harvard Educational Review, Review of Research and Education. And she's also
That's with Jennifer this summer.
Right, that's our collaborative work here. And she's also the editor of School Choice and Diversity, What the Evidence Says, published by Teachers College Press. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott here today to UT Austin.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Haria and all the folks who worked so hard to bring me here. I really appreciate all of your efforts. I know these things don't just happen. It takes a lot of work and a lot of coordination on top of a very often very impacted schedules, and so I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you coming out today when you have lots of other choices. It's a gorgeous day outside. I just got to walk around campus. You could be outside with the birds and the trees. So I appreciate that you're here even more, given how beautiful it is. This is my first time to UT Austin, and I'm really enjoying my visit. Everyone has been so welcoming and so gracious, and I just really appreciate the warm welcome. So thank you all. Today, what I'm going to talk about is a set of findings related to a research project that I have been doing in collaboration with Christopher Lubianski, who's at Indiana University. Actually, my slide says his old institution. I just realized my first typo. And Elizabeth DeBray at the University of Georgia. And we have some wonderful graduate students, Johanna Hanley, Samantha Hedges, and Rachel Williams, working with us. Actually, Haria Jabbar worked on a portion of this study when she was a doctoral student at UC Berkeley, and we are very much indebted to her valuable insights and work on the project. We've been doing work since 2011 on the politics of research utilization. And what's emerged from that work is an appreciation about the relationship between knowledge production, between evidence production, evidence use, and an overall movement to privatize core aspects of K-12 public education. And so today I want to share with you some thoughts about how this work relates to this overall dynamic. We often think about privatization in terms of removing public management or oversight over key aspects of schooling, like running individual schools, contracting out for services. But I want to think about privatization in relation to what it is we know about educational interventions and what we decide to do about them as another form where there's a very active non-governmental space in play. So that's my hope, that at the end of this talk, you'll agree with me that this is something worthwhile for all of us to be thinking about, and some of the implications for the notion of democratic knowledge production as we deliberate about best ways to redress educational inequality. So when I say privatization of education policymaking, I'm referring, in the context of our work, to the increased role of non-governmental actors and organizations who are advocating for particular policies and actually being able to shape those policies. Also engagement in knowledge mobilization, so producing research, but also promoting it, right, and getting it into the hands of decision makers, both public and private. We're seeing a dramatic increase in external contributions to local school board races in an effort to turn school boards, state boards of education, and even congressional and legislative elections to incumbents and candidates who are supportive of particular educational policies. We're seeing investments in core aspects of educational policy, so particularly investments in alternative preparation programs, so programs outside of universities to prepare principals, teachers, and system leaders. Investment in charter management organizations, which many of you probably know quite a bit about, but also in the investment of funding pilot programs that are implemented by public policymakers, but wholly funded by private sector actors with the hope that the public policymakers will take them up and fund them, right? And our awareness is that what we think we know about the relative effectiveness, efficacy of these reforms is highly informed and influenced by who's producing the evidence on them. Okay. So we draw insights from Sapadier, who argues that knowledge, this whole notion of knowledge, what we know for sure, right? This pursuit of truth. I was just over at the Tower building and I was struck by the imprint at the top, right? The truth will set you free. So what do we know about what is true in education? Knowledge does not suddenly appear, become universally accepted, and suggest unequivocal changes in governmental action programs. Instead, findings challenging the accepted wisdom concerning the seriousness of a given problem and its principal causes tend to emerge gradually over time and to be challenged by those who perceive their interests to be adversely affected. So we're informed by this thinking, right, that what we know, like how often have you heard someone say in reference to something they want to persuade you to believe, well, research shows, right? This sort of summation of a whole complex ecology of knowledge, right? The research shows. Research rarely shows one particular direction, right? We know there's a whole political ecology that shapes how research gets used. But we also know that researchers within universities don't always understand this very complex ecology, and we like to think that we'll produce the rigorous research and then someone over there will use it, right? They'll know what to do with it because they'll be so persuaded by our rigor, right, by the conceptual and empirical heft of the work. And we know rationally that's not the case. And we end up with these deeply persistent ways of thinking about policymaking as a result, right? So this idea that policymaking is rational, it happens primarily in public spaces, right? We start with a problem, we seek out information, possible strategies, we do some evaluation of the best strategies, we decide on the policy, we implement the policy, we evaluate the policy, and then we make these adjustments. And even though there's awareness in public policy scholarship that this model really is too simplistic, it persists, right, as a model, despite advancements, conceptual and otherwise. It looks something like this, right? This sort of very rational, linear, lockstep model. Like, how many of you learned this approximation of this kind of model in your domain, right? What we're trying to argue in terms of our own framework in approaching the work is that research use operates in a political ecology, and very much in, ecological models, we're trying to account for what's a part of that ecology. So I'm going to show you just a bit of a display about how we're thinking about this. We're drawing from Marcus Weaver Hightower's 2008 Ed Researcher piece, encouraging educational researchers to think about political ecologies. And in our work, we're trying to think about how what we're calling intermediary organizations, groups that work between schools and public policy domains, how these groups, which I'll call IOs, are really intentionally thinking about knowledge and research production as a part of the political ecology. And we're drawing insights from McCann Ward's notion of policy mobility. So how insights from one particular or set of interventions in one school system are being used to inform preferred changes in another system. So how many of you have heard claims articulated in relation to New Orleans, for example, that we should take the lessons from the New Orleans model and implement them in fill in the blank, right? City or system of choice. Or in a more cautionary way, we should learn from the harmful lessons of New Orleans and not replicate them. But this idea of mobilizing research lessons across systems. So we're thinking about the way that localities around particular policies, educational policies that we're calling incentivist policies. So these are policies that use incentives to drive either individual improvement, performance of teachers, principals, or students, or system or school level improvement. So, an entire district or an individual school or a school network that use an element of incentives with the theory that incentives cause people to do better, to improve practice, and to improve outcomes for kids. So issues like charter schools, vouchers, merit pay for teachers. And in California, we have something called a parent trigger law, which allows parents to convert schools into charter school status if they're low performing, bypassing an approval process. But in our ecology, we're also aware that the federal policies matter for local political context. State education policy matters. The local context and local history, histories of community engagement, histories of unions, the role of unions in these settings, the particular constellation of intermediary organizations in any particular locality, and the role of foundations and philanthropies in shaping all of this landscape. So this is how we're sort of trying to account for everything in an ecology. So when I say intermediary organizations, you might be wondering what I'm talking about specifically, right? So these are groups that with which you might be familiar, with which you might have no familiarity. These are groups that are interested, again, in electoral politics, like Democrats for Education Reform. These are institutes within universities, often operate on soft money, grant money. Many faculty are often very grateful for that soft money, so I don't want to be overly critical about that if you're a recipient. This is just meant to show you the constellation of intermediary organizations that exist. You have education reform and advocacy organizations. Like in Oakland, we have a group called Go Public Schools. You have more national level ones, the Network for Public Education, and so on and so forth, foundations. And so our typology of intermediary organizations tries to account for these different kinds of groups. The research consortia, the foundations, think tanks, school reform organizations, advocacy organizations, civil rights organizations, charter management organizations, and emerging from some of the early findings from our 2011 to 2014 work was a need to understand media as an intermediary. Right? That media appear to be a core translator, promoter, producer of research evidence for policymaking, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. We're looking across 4 school systems, so looking in Denver, New York City, New Orleans, and Los Angeles, and we've also done some work in Washington, D.C., trying to understand the relationship between national level intermediary organizations and local and statewide ones. So I'll just say quickly about methods. I won't go into detail about this. As I said, we've been engaged in this work since 2011. The current iteration of our work will go until the end of next year. So still very much actively collecting data, primarily in New York and Los Angeles right now. We've been cataloging and reviewing all reports. So anytime in any interview someone says research shows, we ask them which research, what are you reading, and then we read it ourselves, which makes for a lot of reading, but really interesting to see what's getting into the hands of particular informants. We're also trying to map the landscape within each city and system and nationally, and we do that through funding patterns, through board membership, staffing and leadership patterns. We've been following blog posting and across bloggers who come up in interviews. And then interviews are our key source of data. Right now we have well over 200 interviews. So I'm going to talk today across 5 core findings. Hopefully I have time to get through all of them. I think I do. So I may fly through 4 and 5, just to be warned. But essentially, across these 5 findings, in case you have to leave, you can know how it all shapes out. We do find different patterns in how politics and governance and kind of local political culture affect this notion of knowledge production and research use, and the extent to which particular private sector actors are really drawing understandings of efficacy of these particular incentivist reforms. We also find that informants are quite versatile in their use of research evidence, and that local research findings often trump national findings. And I'll say more about that. We're sort of calling that local exceptionalism, right? We've also identified that within each case district, there are a few what we call sort of high capacity intermediary organizations that are really effective at brokering knowledge production and evidence on these reforms, and that foundations are these critical hubs of developing those high capacity organizations. As I said, social media sites and bloggers are very much informing evidence debates in local, national, and state contexts. But we're also finding across our cities this desire expressed for a kind of credible, nonpartisan broker of research. And that desire is coming from sort of unexpected quarters. So I should say that, there's this sort of plaintive kind of complaint from researchers that policymakers just ignore evidence, right? We actually don't find that in our work, and we do interview policymakers. Policymakers, we find, are attending to research evidence, but they're not getting their hands on all the evidence. And some of that has to do with ideology, for sure. Some of that has to do with partisanship, but it also has to do with how it's packaged and promoted. And so I do want to talk a little bit then about the space that we're all in a university, and the role of research that comes out of universities by people trained in research methods, in theory building, and how, to the extent that we want our research to matter, might think about that differently, that it's not so cut and dry that policymakers are not interested or not using research. And for qualitative researchers especially, I want to signal that we find many policymakers are quite persuaded by narrative. So the ability to tell a story about one's research, regardless of method, actually matters a great deal for policymakers, and they retell these stories to us in our interviews. All right. So our first finding is that we are not trying to establish any kind of causal relationship, but we're trying to understand, right, relationships of governance and political structure to the use of evidence in a given political ecology. And so what's incumbent upon us then to do that is to actually understand the political ecology of these places, right? And so in Denver, where we've done a lot of work, we've found that research use relates very much to the role of local foundations in Denver, who have really driven convenings and conversations about issues. In Denver, the issues were merit pay. There's a program called ProComp, which is a program that the union signed on to, but also charter schools are quite prominent in Denver. But then foundations are really playing a key convening role in Denver, and there are incredibly strong linkages between the State Department of Education and the city. We also find that local foundations are often receiving quite a bit of money and resources from national foundations, right? So there's a connection there between national foundation agendas. In New Orleans, we found the use of research to be much more marginal, right, and contingent upon kind of political agendas of particular policymakers, both public and private. Data are often quite selectively used, right, to support some existing beliefs about preferred directions, and really marked deep divisions in the intermediary organizational sector. And here is where we hear most vocally a call for an independent broker. The Education Research Alliance, which is a relatively new entity in New Orleans, I think is attempting to fill that void. It's unclear the extent to which people receive it in that way, though, I think it's fair to say. And in New York, we're seeing pro-charter and intermediary organizations heavily involved in research production themselves, really trying to put out evidence on their effectiveness and trying to position themselves as high-quality charter schools, right? There's the Research Alliance for New York City Schools, which is largely centered at NYU. There's hope that that entity would be this kind of broker outside the pro-charter sector, but it, as yet, has not, our informants tell us, is not viewed as super influential. We also see in New York a kind of hub for these organizations. So many organizations that have a national presence have their center in New York City. So they're both local and national. So things like the New Teacher Project and Democrats for Education Reform, based in New York City. But related to this idea of political ecology, if we think about the different kinds of governance involved in New York, across these places, Denver, New York, and New Orleans, we see why it does matter to pay attention to these issues. So that, if you think about leadership across Denver, New York, and New Orleans, for example, very different patterns of leadership, from mayoral control to superintendent to a kind of state takeover model, right? Different policy issues, different forms of electoral politics, anything from an elected school board to an appointed panel, right? That these are all very different constellations of power, of decision-making and deliberation that we think are very important to pay attention to and just fundamentally do not map neatly onto that model I showed you of how policymaking happens from a rational, linear perspective. And when we look at Los Angeles, we see what a beast this system is, right? Well over 500,000 children in the system. Right, so to try and wrap our minds around this kind of political ecology, very diverse demographics, $7.5 billion operating budget, right? These are some of the considerations. Very high concentration of charter schools in an overall system with 1,300 schools. So we see just incredible political diversity that we think researchers often neglect, actually, in terms of understanding the complexity of these systems. So let me just move on to this question of local research evidence. As consumers of research, as producers of research, you know that the research on incentivist reforms is anything but conclusive, right? So on any given day, a new report emerges, for example, on charter schools. Are charter schools doing better, worse, about the same? It's inconclusive. It's contested. And what that does is create a real sense of uncertainty for many people who are deliberating about it in local context. And what we've found in our sites is that in the case of charter schools, for example, people will signal that they're aware of national level research. The Stanford Credo study, which, raise your hand if you're familiar with that study on charter schools. So almost everybody we interview in these cities knows about that study. That is probably the most cited study in our work. So they know that that study generally found that most charter schools using the methods by the researchers perform about the same. About a quarter are performing better and about a quarter are performing much worse, right? So that's the sort of general picture that gets painted by this work. But in our cities, they talk about this study and say, but here, right? We know that out there, that's the picture. Here, the charter schools are so much better, right? So you see this quote from a respondent in Denver, right? They serve, and this is actually talking about, even at a finer granular level, about localities in the Denver metro area. Charters serve a poor and more disadvantaged school population than the general school population in Denver, so the creaming arguments aren't entirely successful. In Metro Denver and in other parts of the state, like if you go to Fort Collins, if you go to Western Slope, you'll get more of the suburban charters that look more like the creaming charters, and there the arguments are stronger against them. But in Metro Denver, there's such high quality and such strong political support and such success, I think it's a settled question, right? So from the state policymaker's perspective, there is no contested research evidence. On New York, obviously, in our world, what Carolyn Hawksby has done and the work in New York City specifically has been important to us in proving our achievement. Equally, the work that Margaret Raymond has done with the Credo study is obviously now of great importance to the charter movement. Her results in New York City are far more positive than averaging across 17 states or territories. So this idea that this is an exceptional place, right? In Los Angeles, we're seeing some interesting convergences across research use. So much more deliberative use of research, much more public debates about what the evidence shows, and in many ways bringing together sort of unexpected interactions among some intermediary organizations. I was sharing this story with some folks last night at dinner. So in Los Angeles, the Broad Foundation is centered in Los Angeles. It's been very interested in expanding charter schools and alternative preparation programs in this system, not just in Los Angeles, but nationally. And there was a leaked report that came out that signaled that the Broad Foundation had a plan to convert over half the schools in Los Angeles to charter schools. And so this report was leaked. It's unclear who leaked it. Lots of people have some theories that are fascinating to hear about. But it caused quite a stir. And the UTLA, which is the teachers union in Los Angeles, was growing increasingly concerned about the sort of fiscal strain that charter school growth was placing on the district. They said that, well, if we do a study on that, no one's going to believe it. So they commissioned a study by an accounting firm. This accounting firm found that, in fact, yes, if the district continues to approve charter schools, it's going to be in serious financial trouble. Well, many people dismiss that study anyway, right? The union paid for it, of course. The LA Area Chamber of Commerce, however, said, wait a minute, we have some concerns. You can't have a healthy business economy if you don't have a healthy school system. Maybe we need to slow down. And so the LA Area Chamber of Commerce has been convening researchers to learn about what can be done to pursue a strategy of charter schools that considers questions of systemic health, right? So the literature would say that the business community would be wholly supportive of this effort, but we're finding in Los Angeles a kind of a sense of needing to slow down. But we also know that LA's political ecology is even more complex and layered than the other systems I mentioned. And the presence of local, state, and national intermediary organizations is quite active and influential. We're seeing community pushback in Los Angeles that is very, I think, quite specific to Los Angeles, has a culture of pushback. So this organizer who says, the thing about Los Angeles, which is a little different than other communities, is the homegrownness of community organizing. In countering kind of this idea that foundations and other groups are organizing parents, that there's a kind of more organic, from this person's perspective, presence. So a few years ago, there was a big building campaign, and there was community organizing that really helped on getting schools built in communities where there had not been a school, where there was a need to build a school. And so just saying that it's harder to sort of import policies from this person's perspective. But at the level of the board staffers are saying that the board, in trying to be responsive to community action, is also being, they're being informed and influenced by other forms of evidence from ed reform and advocacy groups. And so this staffer says, there's a big disconnect, in my opinion, what board members are being told versus what they actually see. And then lamenting the fact that there was not a perception of accessibility of the board to the board between the community members. This new group that emerged after the Broad report leaked, called Great Public Schools Now, is meant to proceed with a charter school growth plan that's maybe more tenable to the community, but people are really worried about this new group as kind of this alpha intermediary organization that's emerging. And so this board staffer says, everything we've heard from Great Public Schools Now, from the Great Public Schools Now people, has been that they fully intend to have dollars allocated for the replication of successful district schools, public district schools, but how that's going to happen and play out and what it's going to look like, I don't think anyone has seen the details or heard any details. So you have this is someone who's a public policy official, right? They're a board member staffer who's saying, in the realm of public policy, we don't know what the plan is, right? The plan is being created somewhere else, right? So we're seeing this as an example of privatization of policymaking in LA. Great Public Schools Now, for example, has awarded close to $5 million. Its first grant recipients were a charter school, Teach for America, and an after-school program. But it's signaling that it's trying to diversify its funding, so some funding to magnet schools as well. In Los Angeles, we're also seeing that research and charter school politics are quite intertwined, right? And so the UTLA official who was part of commissioning the study says about that work, this is not an anti-charter analysis. This is simply saying, what are the impacts? Is this sustainable? What can we do about it? The sustainable system is extremely important. Our research has shown that we were looking at the system as it is currently. It's time to increase costs at the same time decreasing revenues, which is not fundamentally a sustainable model, right? And so as we're seeing then, this sort of push by private sector actors is being met with a resistance that's born out of and informed and attempting to be informed by some evidence. So this is probably the most centric study to our work, is this question of high capacity intermediary organizations and the way that they are creating networks amongst themselves and how foundations are really playing a fundamental role in strengthening and sustaining that sector. So these IOs emerge across our case districts. They're connected across districts. And we're also interested in not just who they are, but how they're functioning, right? So what they're doing is we're finding that they play a convening role in many policy circles. They also talk about being very secure funding-wise. And if you've ever worked in a nonprofit, you know that's not a claim to take lightly. Nonprofits are always, right, having to think about sustaining themselves. And that funding revenue or that funding strength of funding enables them to do not only research but advocacy, right? So really kind of multifocal, multifunctional activities. Many of the high capacity organizations in our case districts are also playing agenda setting roles. Like Great Public Schools Now in Los Angeles, really setting the stage for what they want to happen in the city. And so some examples are the Colorado Education Initiative, New York City Charter Schools Association, New Schools for New Orleans. So as I indicated, national and local foundations are quite active, and they're investing in a number of key activities. Haria and I actually published a piece talking about some of this. So we're seeing anything from essential funding, as I said, but also helping groups that are maybe struggling to not only be established but remain fiscally sound. We're seeing foundations playing a connective role, so helping IOs to connect to one another, and that connection actually helps to concentrate influence, particularly around research evidence. There's also funding dedicated to the gathering, the packaging, the dissemination of research evidence, not just to policymakers, but to news media and to other intermediary organizations. And many organizations not only have a nonprofit arm, but a 501c4 arm, which allows them to engage in political advocacy, right? And that money does not need to be reported. That is dark money. So. We're also seeing within intermediary organizations how it can shape agendas within an organization. So this is an informant from the Manhattan Institute, which is a think tank in New York that is a conservative think tank. And this respondent is talking about how within the Manhattan Institute, what research gets done is highly dependent on who's funding it, right? And so this person is saying that's a whole other area, how money is used to shape the debate. Not just money used to get the ideas out to the larger public and policymaker, but the money from within the community, within in this case, the reform community, or within the conservative think tank, the way in which money dominates. Right? And here are some other examples from our informants. This is the first quote on the left here, my left, I don't know what it is, I can't think that way, on your side. But this is someone who is an intermediary organization that helps to raise money. It's funded by the business community, reflecting on merit pay in New York City, which was established as a pilot program that didn't get taken up. So on the merit pay, that was much easier to raise money for. It was, let's try something new. So it was just raise the money, but that was a direct request from the mayor, in this case, Mayor Bloomberg. Those are slightly different from the policy work. So we didn't do anything on the policy of merit pay. It was just, can you raise money for us? Sure, why not? Right? So the mayor wanted a policy implemented. He bypasses the public sector and goes to the private sector. And in Denver, around the question of research evidence and knowledge mobilization. So this representative from the foundation says, if we feel like this report that had just come out really needs to be shared with legislators, or there needs to be luncheons where they're educated on the implications of the policy recommendations or of the research, then sometimes we step in and play that role. And this is a New Orleans think tank. This is another conservative think tank. What we do and what we spend our time on is connected to the fundraising. If we've raised $50,000 from someone with a particular interest on energy policy, then we're going to spend more time on energy policy. Right? And so we see these linkages then in terms of thinking, the way that money can drive agendas and also drive what we understand about particular policy interventions. In Los Angeles, the role of outside influence and private funding has been particularly acute for any of you who are following LA politics. Spending an outside influence in the 2017 school board elections was the most expensive school board race in US history. So close to $7 million was spent for 3 seats. About $5.4 million was spent by outside labor groups and charter school supporters. So within Los Angeles, the UTLA, which is the Los Angeles local, spent about $1.6 million. You had national policymakers getting involved. So Arne Duncan supported charter school-friendly candidates. Bernie Sanders got in and supported candidates who were more circumspect. We're seeing that large national donors are playing a bigger role in school board elections more broadly, really to ensure charter school majorities on school boards. So places like Denver, Los Angeles, and in Louisiana on the state board. We're seeing just incredible outside money. Michael Bloomberg has been particularly active in this regard in funding school board elections and really trying to turn school boards and state boards. Sarah Rackow and others have been studying this across many school districts. I just want to show you some initial mapping that we've done in Los Angeles in the IO sector to just kind of understand the reach and what these investments buy, right, across the sector. So, oh good, that's displaying okay. Can you all see this from where you are? Okay. So you see the kind of representation of local foundations, where the research community is, charter management organizations, media, who also is getting, who's a recipient of foundations and foundation support, and more local advocacy foundations. We're finding that the charter management organization sector in particular is playing a strong advocacy role and partnering at the state and national level. And UTLA is still a very strong and central force in representing kind of traditional public school interests, but is feeling very much on the defensive in Los Angeles. And they're also doing some interesting work trying to organize charter school teachers in unions at the same time that they're fighting the growth of charter schools, which is putting them politically in interesting position. So let's just talk for a minute about social media. As I said in our interviews, we find that people will often mention that they read about a particular issue or point of evidence either on a blog or on a Twitter post. In DC especially, legislative staffers almost across the board report that they get their information about research evidence from Twitter. Many of you probably know that. Many of you probably had no idea. But that made us all get on Twitter once we learned the importance of that as a mediator of research evidence. And so, and as a result of these insights that our informants were providing for us, we began to interview bloggers and people who were quite active on social media who were being cited by our informants. We're also interviewing, I should say, traditional academic researchers because we want to account for some of the differences in thinking about research promotion and production. And I'll say more about that at the end. So we find that across the bloggers with whom we've spoken, they're not only blogging, right? They're using social media to promote their blogs. So they're using Facebook, they're using Twitter, and other social media forms to signal boost, right, what they're posting. We do find that a handful of academics blog, right? So people like Bruce Baker or Aaron Pallas, Gloria Ledson-Billings, for example, but that many researchers, when we ask them about blogging or even social media, recoil in horror. That may be a generational thing. I'm not sure. But also, I think, a dispositional thing. Like, the way I reacted to Angela when she asked if she could put me on Facebook Live. Even though, right? No. Even though, I mean, I appreciate Facebook Live for what it can do in terms of amplifying issues. So I don't want to leave myself out of the equation. Many bloggers that we talk to talk about their work as being an alternative to journalism, where they feel like many local and more national papers like the New York Times don't do a good job covering educational issues, and that this is an alternative, right? So this person says the media will often pick up whatever the latest study is to come out of MIT or Harvard. But again, there's a real bias. The studies that get the most play are the ones that confirm whatever the narrative is that everyone's already settled upon. So I view my role as a little disruptor. If I've got something that complicates the narrative, that's what I'm interested in trying to help put out there. Another sees himself as an activist, right? You have to make a countervailing force that pushes against the force of money. That's why I spent a lot of time trying to support activism, because I think that's the only thing we can do to get more people active. So that's why my blog has something of an agitational feel to it. It's not just presenting research in a bland way, it's trying to highlight and dramatize the evidence to hopefully motivate people to act and to get organized and to do something. So what we see when we examine the blogs, trying to understand how bloggers are using research evidence and what kind of research evidence they're using, we find that many bloggers do have a perspective, and they are using evidence to justify or confirm, kind of confirmatory use of evidence, their own existing positions. Evidence use can also be quite selective in another way, right? Because media allows you to block alternative perspectives. And so many of them talk about blocking Twitter users with whom they are tired of getting in debates with, trolls, but also in terms of being able to approve responses to your blog. So somebody might disagree with you and say, well, what about this? And you can block that person, right? There's also kind of this, they all talk about the pressure to get things out quickly and how that can work against more deliberative research use. Some bloggers have a target, so some are trying to target practitioners, educators, school leaders. Some are trying to target policymakers. And some aren't clear. They're not really sure who's reading them. They're sort of putting it out there, right? And so this person says, I had a bunch of principals come up to me and say, we're reading your blog. Thanks a lot. You don't know the people. All you see is the numbers. We also have an awareness that many new media sites are being funded by foundations. So we're seeing foundations use these sites as a way to amplify some of the work that the foundation prefers. And many sort of progressive bloggers talk about the importance of not only signal boosting one another, so promoting each other's work, but trying very hard to get Diane Ravage to pay attention to it. Someone called it the Ravage Effect, so that if you can get Diane Ravage to retweet you or to mention your work on her blog, that's when you know your work is getting out there and having an impact. Let me come to my last finding, and I think we're actually doing okay on time. As I said, we are finding across our site that people are feeling a lot of fatigue about feeling like this has created the rise of intermediary organizations. Their investment in knowledge production and promotion is making people feel like they don't know what's going on. And that we hear increasingly from people of all ideological persuasions wanting kind of a reliable source of evidence. Now, I'm just reporting what they're saying. Like, I'm not sure the extent to which they're set up to actually utilize that. But if we take people at their word, they often mention the Chicago Consortium as a kind of example of a research practice partnership that they desire to see. And we have kind of percolations of that kind of model within each city. So Los Angeles has the Los Angeles Education Research Alliance, which is still very much, I think, finding its footing. In New Orleans, you have the Cowan Institute and the Education Research Alliance, the Research Alliance in New York City, that people are wanting models like that actually have some credibility and some rigor. In the absence of that, you have what an informant told us in New Orleans, in the Orleans Parish Education Network, that there's this culture of mutual mistrust that's created with all the evidence, all the knowledge that's trying to make its way into the political ecology. And this person says, I have no problem saying this, but I think we're really plagued by the same two narratives. It's either everything is going great or things are going to hell. There's a middle ground. I do believe we need to have a more honest conversation about the current state of affairs in New Orleans public education. What's missing is honesty, meaning it just would be really helpful if the folks who are in the game didn't have a particular stake in the game, so that it would be more neutral, but everyone who comes to the table is coming with an angle, even us. So where does that leave us? I don't know, but I have some ideas. From a research perspective, we do want to emphasize that we think paying attention to these different structures, these different ecologies matters. It matters, we think, in the way that research evidence is used, the way it's produced. We know that these ideological echo chambers exist, right? And these silos abound, but we don't think that we can really permeate them if we don't understand their existence. And so we really are leaning toward a call for researchers to understand this new terrain, not stick to these rational linear models when we're trying to understand policymaking and its effects. We also think it's important to understand that intermediary organizations are not one thing, right? Some are comprehensive organizations, they've been around forever, some are much more newly created, some are deeply involved in advocacy, some are more involved in research, and so understanding the topology is very important. Social media use is, I think, an underexplored area for educational researchers, and I think understanding how evidence is getting into policy debates is really important to understanding our own role as university-based researchers, because what we know from Fishman and Tafara and others is that most of us prepared in kind of traditional university settings, we're not engaged in knowledge mobilization strategies. We're not really actively promoting our work. I think of Angela actually as someone who really flies against that overall tendency. But not only that, we're often disconnected from these intermediary organizational networks. Like, we don't think about trying to get our work into the hands of these networks necessarily, or even to interact with them and share understandings. On the other hand, although university-based research that appears in journals, right, that's presented at conferences, people often talk about why they don't use it in the public policy space, as, that it takes too long, first of all, to produce. There's no clear sight line to what you're supposed to do. It's full of jargon. Like, all of those critiques notwithstanding, what we also hear from our informants is that people trust university research more than they know that think tank research has a perspective, especially if the think tank is ideological. But they see researchers as actually having something to offer in terms of rigor, in terms of theory. And I think we underestimate that unique role that we have as researchers in training. And so we think there really is an untapped potential here to form more intentional research practice partnerships in collaboration with school districts, with school systems, with system leaders. And so as a way of thinking about and understanding the current political ecology where private sector actors are really exerting unprecedented influence over our schools and school systems. So I will stop there and answer any questions. Hello. Hi.
Hi, Dr. Scott. Thank you for coming. It was really fantastic having you here. My name is Cecile. My name is Cecile Riley. I was a former principal in LAUSD in South Los Angeles.
Great.
So I hear a lot of the things that we've been dealing with in LA for 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and not just the recent history. So I have two questions for you. In terms of the research that you're doing right now as you're gathering evidence, what impact is the board elections, because it's so fresh and it's so new, are you seeing now as you're speaking to respondents?
Yeah.
And as the anxiety levels are raising in all parts of the ecology?
Right.
And then my second question is, as we are moving forward to this threat of reduced funding and even, the HR bill, the House bill that's just out to dismantle the DOE, what effects do you think this may, everything is all speculation, right, have with the relationships now that public districts and, especially in a place like Los Angeles, will have with private funders and nonprofit organizations? So,
yeah, so I feel like they're both really important, hard questions, but I'll do the first one because it's less hard because we don't know as much. So you've probably been following that the so-called ed reform candidate got indicted, right, for for fraud. So, I mean, our sense from our informants is people are really feeling like this is really chaotic. And, you know, if you think back to the slide where I was presenting some of the demographic information in Los Angeles, sort of confused about why charter schools seems to be driving the school board agenda when it's such a big school district doing so many other things, right? And so I think there's real confusion about how this has come to ascend as the signature issue. I think the critical questions that the LA Area Chamber is asking actually is unique across our school systems, and I don't know if it will wholly affect what actually happens, but there seems to be some emerging consensus of the need to be more deliberate. So I think it's still unknown, but those factors lead me to think that, you know, I think the indictment especially sort of threw people, and that's not done, right? Because it's unclear how many people were involved to the extent that actually happened, and there was some fraud in terms of donations, that there were, you know, there may be a kind of collusion issue, and so people I think are still waiting for how that's all going to shake out. But we do get the sense from informants that people are sort of going, wait, what's going on, and we need to slow down, which I think creates a deliberative space. Now, what happens in that space is highly informed by the second question you ask, right? I think California is unique because of our state level politics right now, right? And there actually is some strong consensus around, you know, the local control funding formula, which is a fiscal equity effort in California, for those of you who don't know. But also this new metric, the dashboard for measuring school quality, that considers not just test scores and school quality, that there seems to be a broadening and a moving away from the kind of ed policy agenda of the last decade or so. That may also feed into some of what we see happen in Los Angeles and in other districts in California, regardless of what happens at the federal level, right? And so I think it's still unknown, but I think those factors will contribute to something probably quite different than in other states, and then down to the school systems within a state. But I don't know, what do you think?
Well, when I was there, was a lot of participation with nonprofits who I didn't expect to start rising up and joining the space.
Yeah.
And, you know, even the universities, you know, all the new charter schools come out with university backing. Green Dot looking for unionization. I mean,
Right.
all these things are just so new.
Yeah.
And then even the talk within the district itself in providing, you know, single gender schools, like all these different layers, I feel like is trying to address the web of players in the district. Because a lot of times I feel like a lot of districts, they're only dealing with 3 or 4, you know, funders. Like, but not only does LA have Broad, it has like, you know, all sorts of funders from all over the place, and a lot of them are linked to the Chamber of Commerce, which I think is ironic,
right?
Because
I know,
no, right? So I feel like
that.
You know, if you start digging even with the foundations who are getting involved, and then even the small localized nonprofits who are getting involved, like Para Los Niños, and right, and even BAM has their hat in the game.
Yeah.
So even with that, I feel like it's so huge and just so diverse and so many players that there's a, you know.
So try studying that. But I welcome your insight. I mean, as someone who has internal understandings of these things, because we, you know, like as with any research, we want to get it right. Like we want to make sure the story we think we're able to tell is the story that maps most accurately onto what people are experiencing. So, yeah. Right.
Completely different demographically.
Yeah.
So even where our charter schools are popping up, is, you know,
Yeah.
it's just so.
Right. Yes. And the first charter schools in the state were really on the west side of Los Angeles. So that's the other factor, is that portion of the city broke away early on, right, in the early 90s. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I didn't mean to freak you out.
Oh, no, it's okay. I'm easily freaked out. It's not you.
Okay.
It's not.
Yeah, no, just students, everybody wants to be here, and thank you for coming. This is so
powerful what you're presenting, and I'm wondering because I saw that one slide of the ecology, and is there anyone there working with you that might be doing like a critical race analysis of that ecology? I mean, to what extent is it? I mean, basically white, CEOs and. Entrepreneurs, hedge fund managers, and sort of like sort of objectifying these communities. You mentioned money, right? Yeah. And so, if money is just another way of saying that that's the extent to which we're interested in you, in the way that minority communities are being objectified. So I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, we're certainly attending to that. That's one of my core interests in our work. Is so we interview. And try to account for all organizational actors. As I was hinting at in Los Angeles, but this is true across our case districts. In every district, there have been communities organizing forever, right, for equity and access and representation. And so we're trying to we don't exclude those groups simply because they don't have access to funding, right? Because they are a part of the ecology. They are trying to shape policy. What we find is because they lack funding, they're often local, they fund themselves, right? And are principled about not wanting money. Principled in the sense that they have a set of values and ethics that to them make them clear, right? That the line is quite bright. There are other groups that say we have those same ethics and principles, but we think we can use the money strategically, right? So people are positioning themselves all over the place in these cities. So we're trying to just account for that. What we find is that even though these groups very often are collecting evidence, right? Oral histories, collecting parent testimonials about what's happening to their kids in schools, that it's very hard for them to permeate this deliberative space. They talk about like the need for some like brokers between themselves and public and private policymakers. But we're also seeing, this is particularly was acute in New Orleans, are groups that are raising questions about some of the research claims about efficacy of these reforms. So in New Orleans, the reform is charter schools and private management of charter schools, and Teach for America being a big part of that story. So in New Orleans, the issue is the extent to which these schools are accessible to all kids, particularly special kids with disabilities. And parents are, have been actively organizing around that question, but also questions of democratic representation on decision-making bodies. And one of our informants, who's a long-time civil rights organizer in the city, just told this story that I think really captures what is happening in many of the communities in which we're doing our work, where he talked about, I can go from one night in an organizing planning session at someone's house for dinner, and then the next week when we're ready to present our demands, people who have been at that organizing dinner have moved over as paid staffers to the pro-reform side. And he's like, I don't fault them. These people need jobs, right? There are no jobs in this city, and these people pay, and they pay well. And so he talked really about how it's creating divisions within progressive grassroots communities of color, right? As people are trying to make decisions about their political commitments, but also their need for survival. And so we're trying to account for that and pay attention to that as well. I'm not sure if that's what you're in part getting at, but yeah.
But, and I'm thinking about school board member races.
Yeah.
So we have the least diverse board that we've ever had, or in 20 years, here in Austin, and it was a lot of the charter school money that really impacted that outcome, and that's happening everywhere.
Right. I think there have been a lot of critiques in the kind of funding advocacy world about the question of racial and ethnic diversity, but the response has been to find people from who are Black or Latino who share the kind of political ideology. And so we see diversity, but it's right. And so I think that's been the response to that critique, at least in our case cities.
So we probably don't have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay.
Did anybody in your study, oh, okay, sorry. So, Okay, there was a debate between two leaders of our Texas political parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, a couple weeks ago, and the Republican political leader said that school choice was the civil rights issue of our time. And so do you see any evidence of that, like marketization of civil rights in your study? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's probably, aside from research shows, that may be one of the most oft repeated claims around,
What
yeah.
do you say in response? Like, how do you, like, tell that person off when they say that?
I don't.
You don't have to respond to that.
No, I mean, what we do is we're trying to get at how people come to the conclusions they come to, right? And I mean, when we proposed this work, it wasn't, I didn't realize how much it was going to make me think about the nature of knowledge and beliefs, and how we as citizens come to believe the things we believe and trust that what we believe is true, right? So we engage in these, we're like philosophically, like the nature of truth. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. So what I've come to understand is that somebody making that claim is basing it on an understanding of the world and an understanding of justice and an understanding of history. And I want to know more about that. So I ask them. So that's my response, is to say, tell me more about that. What have been the civil rights issues from your perspective? What causes educational inequality? By far, my favorite question on our interview protocol is tell us about the last thing you read or heard that made you change your mind. And so I guess I challenge all of you to think about that. What was the last thing you read or heard that fundamentally made you change your mind about something you thought you were certain about?